Welcome to the module Non-Formal Education of the course Growth and Value. For an NGO that focuses on addressing the needs of young people, it is highly likely that non-formal education will play a key role in the organization's goals and actions. In this regard, a leader of such an NGO needs to have a reflective understanding of what non-formal education is, why it is important, and how it can be effectively implemented. Therefore, in this module, we will explore the meaning of non-formal education and why it is important. We will look at approaches and tools for non-formal learning. We will explore how to frame non-formal learning objectives, and we will consider the mechanisms for recognition of non-formal learning. The central learnings of this module are as follows. 1. Non-formal education is a system or process for providing learning. 2. Non-formal education is not informal, unorganized, or less serious than formal education. 3. Non-formal education is intentional and has predefined learning objectives. 4. Flexibility within non-formal education gives a possibility to provide less tangible learning outcomes and attitudinal learning outcomes. 5. There are no fixed methods or approaches in delivering non-formal education. However, it should ideally provide space for reflection and learning through experience. 6. Learning objectives in non-formal education are often divided into 3 types of learning: knowledge, skill, and attitude. 7. Whilst it is not usual to grade learning outcomes within non-formal education, it is important to consider the recognition of the learning achievements. As with any form of education, non-formal education can be understood as a system or process for producing learning. The term non-formal, when referring to education or learning, can be interpreted in slightly different ways depending upon the context in which it is being viewed. However, it should not be misunderstood as less serious education, less important education, or unorganized education. Within this module and the Growth and Value course in general, non-formal education is understood as a framework or process that provides learning which takes place through planned activities where some form of learning support is present, but which is not part of the formal education and training system. Informal learning is generally understood as learning resulting from daily activities related to work, family, or leisure, which is not organized or structured in terms of objectives, time, or learning support. It may be unintentional from the learner's perspective. Typically, informal is only referred to in terms of learning and not used in reference to education, as it is generally considered that learning can take place informally, but education, meaning a system or process for learning, requires a certain level of structure and defined intent. But now, let us look at the history of the term non-formal in relation to learning and education to help in our understanding. The origins of non-formal education can be challenging to pinpoint, as non-formal education could be seen as having taken place ever since learning has taken place. It is widely considered that one of the first intentional forms of non-formal education in Europe began in Denmark in the 19th century, through the thinkings of the educational philosopher N.F.S. Grundtvig. In that period, education was only accessed by the elite and primarily understood to be an academic study. However, Grundtvig felt that education had a bigger role to play in society. He recognized a need for learning to take place across society in order for a democracy to function. Furthermore, he considered exams and other forms of educational obligations to be counterproductive to learning, and instead felt that education should promote personal development through a spirit of discovery, freedom, and cooperation. Whilst non-formal education may have existed long before this, it is often considered to be the first time it was recognized that there is a need for education that is different to conventional education, and that there are various types of learning needs that education should address. Many of Grundtvig's thoughts on education are prevalent in non-formal education practices today. The importance of Grundtvig's thoughts were recognized by the European Commission when it named its funding program for adult education the Grundtvig Program from 2007 to 2012. But back in the 19th century, Grundtvig's approach was not referred to as non-formal education. It was known as popular education or people's education. So, let us look at when the term non-formal education was first used. Non-formal as a term in education and learning is generally considered to have been first used in the 1970s. During this period, a number of educational experts began to explore and define informal learning and non-formal education. For example, in 1973, the U.S. Secretary of State for Education, P.H. Coombs, co-authored a book that explored the role of youth education in rural development. Within the publication, Coombs identified and defined non-formal education as organized, but outside the formal sector, serve identifiable clientele and has learning objectives. Coombs continued to explore non-formal education into the late 1980s. Moving into the next decade, in 1996, the Organization for Economic Co-operation and Development, also OECD, introduced the Lifelong Learning for All strategy, which included 23 countries from 5 continents who together sought to clarify and validate all forms of learning, including formal, non-formal, and informal. This has been in conjunction with the European Union, which also developed policies for lifelong learning and subsequently have integrated non-formal education into their youth programs up to the present-day Erasmus Plus program. Through the Erasmus Plus program, €1.47 billion have been directly invested into non-formal education activities in the youth sector over a period of 7 years. The Erasmus Plus program defines non-formal learning as learning which takes place through planned activities, where some form of learning support is present, but which is not part of the formal education and training system. Today, non-formal education is still in a state of elaboration in terms of its intentional deliverance, its widespread recognition, and its definition. As non-formal education itself is flexible and dynamic, so is its definition and practical usage. There is not necessarily one way of understanding non-formal education that is exclusively correct. However, this course is based upon the understanding of non-formal education, which is aligned by the definition of non-formal learning provided by the Erasmus Plus program. But let's look at it a bit further, also considering the previously discussed historical context. Non-formal education can be understood as a system or process for producing learning that takes place outside of formal education systems, meaning it is not part of mandatory school structures and curricula, and as such, it does not necessarily need to be assessed through grades, and it is based on voluntary participation. It is based upon an identified learning need. As was the case with Grundtvig in the 19th century, non-formal education typically addresses a societal need and is flexible enough to address such learning need. In this regard, it should be able to offer learning that supports personal development and attitudinal change. It is intentional yet semi-structured, meaning it is not happening by accident. It is delivered with the intention of producing predefined learning objectives within a given time frame, but at the same time, as it is not defined by a curriculum or formal structure, it can be flexible and changeable in its approach. It should offer space for discovery and reflection, meaning that the learning process should not be teacher-focused nor focused on learning for graded assessment, but should be participative and should offer space for the learner to form their own conclusions through experience and conflict of thought. So why is non-formal education important? Well, it should not be thought of as more or less important than formal education, but recognized for its importance as a counterpart to formal education. Formal education is important. It is fixed by a set curriculum and, to an extent, a set learning environment. It needs to be concretely structured and defined in order to assess and measure its outcomes in the short-term perspective, and it needs to be a generic process so that results can be compared and benchmarked. Whereas non-formal education, as a general rule, is not bound by mandatory participation, standardized curriculum, or grading of learning outcomes, it has the possibility to address learning needs that are less tangible but no less important. In order to have the competencies for active social participation, employment, and self-actualization, young people need competencies that sit outside of conventional educational disciplines or subjects. In many cases, such competencies cannot be taught, but need to be learned through experience and the reflection of experience. Furthermore, such competencies can be difficult to grade through exams and measure according to standardized scales. By the very essence that non-formal education is not strictly defined, it is able to be flexible and meet the intangible, experience-based learning needs of young people. While non-formal education as a defined practice is still being contested and debated, its importance is increasingly acknowledged. As mentioned in the previous slide, the European Commission has recognized its importance with regards to youth education and has, through the Erasmus Plus program, allocated a budget of €1.47 billion to youth activities focused strongly upon non-formal education. Non-formal education can be planned and delivered by a wide variety of actors, including different associations and community groups such as Scouts or church-based organizations, as well as other organizations and institutions, including, in some cases, formal education institutions such as a university or schools that offers evening classes or workshops over the summer. It may also be planned and delivered by your NGO. There is no one fixed method to support learning in non-formal education per se. By engaging in this course, you are engaging in non-formal learning. But that, of course, does not imply that all non-formal education should or must take place through online courses. The tools and methods used to achieve desired learning outcomes through non-formal education depend upon the nature of those intended learning outcomes and the target group of the learning. There are countless different approaches and methods for delivering non-formal education. An example could be when an NGO organizes a training course to develop young people's intercultural competencies, or when a school organizes a trip to London for its students. It's important to highlight, however, that these examples are a mere fraction of the variety of activities that can be organized within non-formal education. However, as mentioned before, NFE should offer space for discovery and reflection, meaning that the learning process should not be teacher-focused, not focused on learning for graded assessment, but should be participative and should offer space for the learner to form their own conclusions through experience and conflict of thought. In this regard, non-formal education is often considered most effective in group environments. In a group learning processes, the participants can engage in experiences and reflections that can supply their learning. This requires that the process is supported through facilitating group dynamics with open environments and the use of tools and methods to take participants outside of their comfort zone to experience situations that are new or unfamiliar, or to experience a situation where their knowledge, skill, and attitude has to be applied to navigate a particular situation. Such learning environments can be facilitated in many ways, and there is a wide range of materials available that offer non-formal education tools and methods. some of which are presented in the reading list of this module. As we have discussed, non-formal education is intentional. It addresses identified learning needs and therefore is delivered according to predefined learning objectives. The learning objectives in some cases may be flexible, and the unforeseen learning outcomes in non-formal education can be as important as the predefined expected learning outcomes. Nevertheless, learning objectives in non-formal education are crucial in creating a structure for which to achieve the intentions it set out to create. Therefore, the challenge lies in how to structure and define learning objectives for an educational process that is semi-structured and develops intangible learning outcomes. A commonly applied approach is to delineate learning into 3 categories: knowledge, skill, and attitude, commonly referred to as Bloom's taxonomy. Knowledge meaning retainment and understanding of information, for example, knowledge of cultural habits in another country. Skill meaning the ability to practically undertake an action, for example, skills to communicate beyond language barriers. And attitude meaning the manner in which a person deals with things emotionally based on learned values and feelings, for example, acceptance and appreciation of cultural differences. None of these can be considered a competence by itself, but the combination of the 3 helps acquire competence in a certain area. For example, intercultural competence can be developed when you have acquired the skills to communicate beyond language barriers, you have knowledge of culture in another country, and an appreciation of cultural differences. This model shows how the 3 types of learning outcomes can influence each other and how they are mutually important in developing competence. As we have determined, the learning outcomes of non-formal education are usually not graded or assessed. However, this should not diminish the importance of recognizing the learning outcomes of non-formal education. Recognition of non-formal learning is vital for different reasons. Since non-formal education is intentional, it is important to be able to recognize learning outcomes to monitor and evaluate the extent to which the intentions have been realized. Despite not offering standardized grades, non-formal education can offer competencies that are essential to wider society and the labor market. However, if not acknowledged and recognized, the competencies gained through non-formal education may be left dormant, unutilized by the learner, and unvalued by employers and wider society. So, the challenge lies in how to recognize learning that is not graded through standardized frameworks and in its very nature can be intangible. A primary means by which this can be achieved is through facilitating reflection and recognition through debriefs. In the context of non-formal learning, debriefs refer to a conversational exercise that takes place in plenary or in groups at the end of a learning activity. The facilitator poses questions to the participants to encourage them to reflect upon the information received and situations experienced during the activity, thus supporting their recognition of the achieved learning. In order to further support the recognition and documentation of learning, SALTO, on behalf of the European Commission, has developed YouthPass. YouthPass provides the opportunity to reflect upon and document learning outcomes based around 8 key competencies and recognizes competence as the combination of skills, knowledge, and attitude. Between 2007 and 2020, over 1 million YouthPass certificates have been issued to recognize and document learning achieved within non-formal education. We have now reached the end of this module. Let us sum up the lessons learned. 1. Non-formal education is a system or process for providing learning. 2. Non-formal education is not informal, unorganized, or less serious than formal education. 3. Non-formal education is intentional and has predefined learning objectives. 4. Flexibility within non-formal education gives a possibility to provide less tangible learning outcomes, and attitudinal learning outcomes. 5. There are no fixed methods or approaches in delivering non-formal education. However, it should ideally provide space for reflection and learning through experience. 6. Learning objectives in non-formal education are often divided into 3 types of learning: knowledge, skill, and attitude. 7. Whilst it is not usual to grade learning within non-formal education, it is important to consider the recognition of the learning.